Welcome to the Book Bungalow's virtual author event, featuring Levi Rogers, author of the book, Utah, a Novel. My name is Tanya Mills, and I'm the owner and manager of the Book Bungalow in St. George, Utah. Southern Utah's only independent bookstore offering all new books and a full range of events. We're still doing many of our events virtually and plan to continue a mix of virtual and live events in the fall, depending on how COVID progresses or its variants. With our author's approval, we decided to change our format from a webinar. I've got to admit someone. To change our event from a webinar to a meeting so you could interact better with the author and ask any questions you may have more directly. The meeting is being recorded. In a minute, I'll be turning the time over to Levi to do a reading from his novel before he takes questions. If you haven't already purchased his book, either in our store or through Eventbrite, I'll be adding a link in the chat room to order it through our website. I'll also post a link to his website so that you can learn more about him and his writing. And you'll all receive a follow-up email in a couple of days that will include both links again, as well as a link to the recording, which we'll be posting to our YouTube channel. Levi Rogers has an MFA from Antioch University, Los Angeles, and a Bachelor's of English from the University of Utah. He has attended residencies at the Tin House Summer Workshop in 2018, the Writers Hotel in 2017, and the Lighthouse Writers Workshop in 2020. He is currently working with the new broadside literary journal, Meow Meow Pow Pow, as a blog editor. I'm going to ask you about that later. He's published essays, poetry, and reviews in the Clackamas Review, Entropy, Sojourners, Lunch Ticket, Drunk Monkeys, Sprudge, Roast Magazine, Fresh Cup, and Devour Magazine, amongst others. Fresh Cup must refer to your coffee. Okay. He also owns and runs a coffee roasting company, La Barba Coffee, in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he lived for the last 8 years before moving to Portland, Oregon 2 years ago. He lives with his wife, Kat, his daughters, Evangeline and Emerson, his dog, Amelie, and 2 cats, Chicken and Waffles. I love those names. Utah, a Novel is his first book, published this year through Atmosphere Press. He's also working on a memoir about youth, faith, depression, and belonging called Everything Must Belong Somewhere. And I'm going to turn the time over to Levi now so he can share a brief passage from his book.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Tanya and the Book Bungalow for having me. I was hoping to do an in-person event this summer, but as things have gone, didn't quite work out. But hoping to get down there eventually one day. So yeah, I'm going to read just a couple parts from the book, probably one part in the beginning and then one towards the end that is set closer to St. George in Zion area. And so I kind of, I grew up in Colorado. Just real quick, I grew up in Colorado, would take trips to Moab every summer. And so I was very familiar with some parts of Utah, and then ended up moving there. Was involved with a church actually for a little bit. And then, and I just found the state really interesting, and I found people's perceptions of it really interesting too. And it found it, and so I thought someone needs to write, and lots of people have written a book, but I wanted to write a book kind of about the sort of things that are commonplace in Utah, but also the things that are not just so kind of stereotypical as well. And so tried to include like a very diverse cast of characters in the book as well. And so, yeah, I've lived in the West all my life, and so it's very much rooted, in the West. And with all the concerns, as you'll see from this first part, this is wildfire season. I don't know, is it hazy there right now?
I muted myself so my phone would stop, my computer would stop dinging. It's It's the haze is kind of lifted for the most part. It's still slightly. We're still getting some from California, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna start reading. So this is chapter 1, Dutch oven. I also have I don't know if you can see, there's a fun little map. It's actually a local guy from just north of Salt Lake that does these cool maps. Sorry, it's not the best view, but state of Utah map, kind of Lord of the Rings style. Really happy about that. And so the characters kind of start up here, Logan, and then kind of make their way all the way down to Zion eventually. Chapter 1, Dutch Oven, Saturday. Adios, America. Logan, Utah. Smoke and ash stung Becca's nostrils when she entered the outside world. The air smelled of campfire and pine as a yellow haze smothered the streets in every direction. Wildfires, from Montana and Idaho to Oregon, Colorado, Washington, and of course, California. The entire West was on fire, white smoke from Baja to British Columbia, San Francisco to Salt Lake. It was Labor Day weekend, and the fires in the US now burned earlier, longer, and hotter. The rains came less frequently. The temperatures refused to cool, even at night. You could feel the air, dry, hot, and stagnant, ready to burst. Becca's eyes began to water as she looked up at the sun. The yellow star was now the color of pink lemonade. Lee, we need to go, Becca shouted inside as she opened the front door with her daughter Annalise in the car seat. Now! A tiny scream issued from underneath the blanket. Shh, Becca whispered. I know, it'll be okay. Would it though? Becca shut the front door behind her and rushed down the stairs to get the baby in the car and out of the smoke. Their small neighborhood of Logan, Utah was still asleep. Nothing moved besides the birds. No cars, no humans, no wind. Just smoke and ash. The smell of hot doom in the atmosphere. Did these people not see? Did they not hear? It was a level 2 evacuation, meaning be packed and ready to go at a moment's notice. Yet not quite a level 3 evacuation, i.e., go now. The fire was still a few miles away, yet Becca didn't want to be a story on KSL News later. One of a mom with a charred baby trapped in a car off the side of the road who had waited too long to leave. They were evacuating south to stay with family in Salt Lake and beyond. Becca buckled Annalise inside the car and ran back inside. In a way, Becca thought of these wildfires as a strange mercy. She didn't know whether she could handle being a mother, and she saw no way out. She and Lee were trying to make it work. They'd even gotten married, but the question of whether they were going to make it work was still undecided. Becca wanted to be a good mother more than anything in the world, yet she had a sick feeling in her stomach that she never would. She was tired of being alone with an infant and only too happy to go someplace where she would have help. She wanted an out. Lee, what? Are you listening to me? Becca was standing in the doorway to the basement now, looking down. You never listened, Becca continued. You were always lost somewhere in your head. Lee began to roll his eyes as he leapt up the stairs with some instant meals in their camping stove. And don't roll your eyes at me. It's the number 1 sign of divorce, she said. He greeted her, as if to apologize, with a small kiss on her cheek. Well, you rolled your eyes back there at me earlier in the kitchen, you know. Becca rolled her eyes at him again. Did we get everything? I hope so. Lee grabbed the rest of their supplies in the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee permeating their duplex. Becca grabbed their travel mugs and left the Chemex sitting by the sink. The two of them walked outside, and Lee locked the front door of their tiny duplex behind them. Becca sarcastically thinking that the imminent destruction of the planet via volcano or earthquake or wildfire seemed more pleasant to her than marriage or motherhood. But that's also why she'd married Lee, their shared sense of dark humor, and Annalise, of course. They walked briskly down the stairs. Did you get the bottles? Beck asked him. Yes. Did you get the diaper bag? Yes. Denali? She's in the car. Annalise? I just put her in. See, said Lee, smiling, trying to ease the tension because he was a people pleaser by nature. We're killing this parenting thing. At least we haven't killed each other yet, said Becca. Or ourselves, said Lee. Becca and Lee smiled at each other as they each opened the car door, the only moment of considerate pause for each other in their whole morning. Becca looked up into the sky. Ash floated to the ground like snow. It fell atop the cars and driveways and the fresh white sprinkle of disappearing forests. Lee loaded the rest of their supplies into the topper of their old green Outback, Yellowstone National Park and Keep Tahoe Blue stickers adorning the side. Becca raced around the front of the car. Lee buckled his seatbelt and put the car in drive. The pack and play, Becca shouted. It was still on the porch. Lee returned to park. I'll get it, he sighed, opening his door, but Becca was already out the car. She ran back up the stairs, grabbed the pack and play, ran back down, opened up the hatch, and shoved it inside, slamming the hatch shut. The loud noise made Annalise flinch. Lee raised an eyebrow at Becca as she returned to the passenger door, and then he shut his door, gently, as if to show her how one was supposed to shut the doors of the car with a tiny baby, gently. Oh, please, she said to Lee. She was going to cry either way. She's been fussy all morning. They sped off down the road, their car haphazardly packed with camping gear, suitcases, laptops, journals, pictures, passports, wallets, birth certificates, insurance information, toiletries, tote bags, diapers and wipes, and everything else they considered valuable, which actually wasn't much. Becca wondered if they'd ever see their tiny duplex again. She didn't care, really. It was a rental anyways. Besides, the world was burning. Adios, America. And so Beck and Lee and their daughter are kind of the main characters in this book, but there's several other characters, and this book is written from the perspective of 5 or 6 other characters as well, and they all kind of end up, you know, in Zion at the end. And so I'm going to skip down to there. And yes, here we go. And so I'll start. The morning sun broke bright and clear over the black asphalt. Lee drove, Becca sat shotgun. Lee took a sip of his coffee and accidentally rumbled over the rumble strips on the right side of the road. He corrected, Becca raising her eyebrows at him, and he would grip the steering wheel firmly. They didn't look at each other, they didn't smile, but the short conversation softened both of them from earlier. So far, the scenery was nothing spectacular. Brown dirt, scrub oak, more small juniper trees and pinyon, rocky hills. But that was how these places in the desert were. Miles of nothing, and then bam, the sudden appearance of majestic cliffs or arches or mountains. They turned right on State Highway 89 and then left on Route 9. Farther west and south of them lay the Grand Staircase and Bears Ears National Monuments, federal land that had been downsized some years ago and had been in endless litigation ever since. Lawsuits trading hands from the native tribes to oil and gas companies, environmental groups, and so on, while the land sat mostly empty, which was either good or bad depending on one's philosophy. Soon, smooth waves of red rock dotted the landscape in front of Becca. The freshly paved road was black and glistening, and marked on either side by bright white lines. A yellow dotted center, the road began to twist and turn to navigate the jutting geographical landscape. The red and white rocks around them were like small desert hobbit holes, round and smooth. Stratified lines of erosion etched over their surface like the fossilized wakes of a rattlesnake. The rocks soon grew in size and came to dominate the hills around them. Reddish-brown sand covered the road. 100 yards ahead, they could see the black shadow of a tunnel. Their green Subaru entered the darkness, and Lee turned on the lights. But it was not all black. A quick bend in the road, and there was once again light. Short tunnel, Becca thought. But the tunnel continued. To her right, windows appeared. Not windows made of glass, but rectangles cut out of the sidewall of the sandstone itself, giving one a glimpse into the valley of red and green below them. This is called the Zion Mount Carmel Tunnel, Lee said. He was clearly happy to see how shocked she was. I forgot you've never been to Zion before. Aren't these windows cool? Light now mixed with darkness and kaleidoscoped across the windshield. Soon they emerged from the tunnel and Becca gasped. They were shooting left alongside a wide and steep valley that overtook the entirety of their vision. An immense, deep, wide, green, fertile valley like something out of Land Before Time or Mesopotamia, stretched out before them, like the Garden of Eden. In the distance, Becca could see the towers and ridges of red rock standing guard over the great green valley. That's called the Sentinel, Lee said, returning to the narration of the trip. Never in her life had Becca had her breath physically taken away by scenery, or anything really. She gasped again. The tunnel was such an extreme demarcation between the beautiful and the truly beautiful. The southwestern desert of Utah, the Zion, that it felt like she had just been transported into another world. This valley in front of her was unlike the other desert features of Moab or Canyonlands or Bryce or Arches. Here in the streak of green and orange and red in the middle of nowhere, it was an oasis, a small pocket of land secretly hidden inside a harsh landscape with a dry, desolate, and cracked earth. Here, there was water overflowing and lush greenery abounded. The road itself turned reddish brown and switched back down the hill in a seemingly never-ending pattern of Z's and S's, more of the same brown oak and bright green of juniper bushes, ponderosa pines, and scrub oak alongside them. The base of the valley lay below, a small blue river coursing through the center of it. The high mid-morning sun shone bright and clear. You know, Lee continued, originally they named this Mukuntuweap National Monument, but the director of the National Park Service changed the name in the 1918 to what the Mormons called it when they first settled the land in 1847. Zion. It was, how did my dad put it back when I was a kid, done for ethnocentric reasons, which, you know, basically means they thought more white people would go to the park if the name was easier to pronounce. Ha, figures, Becca said, still shocking this from you. How do you know all this? Lee shrugged. My dad. And then I'll keep going just for a second more. They stopped in Springdale to get gas, a refill on coffee, and use the bathroom. The traffic now stretched thick all around them, and the illusion of wilderness gave way to a Disneyland-like euphoria and claustrophobia. But they eventually found their way to what appeared to be the main parking lot, parked, and grabbed a multi-folded brochure of the park from a ranger station. It looked like they needed to take a bus through the main canyon of Zion because it was so narrow. Since the park was now one of the most crowded national parks in the country, no cars were allowed in the canyon. Zion is, in fact, officially now the most visited national park in America, surpassing even Yellowstone and Yosemite, which also meant it was a cluster. All right, and then I'll read one more part. And so it kind of in the background of this book is this is the Yellowstone Supervolcano, and the idea that one of the main characters becomes kind of obsessed with the thought that it might explode and kind of wipe everything out. And so it becomes, to me, is kind of a fun ticking clock to use for the extra element of tension, but also kind of as a metaphor too for these sort of big things in the world that are happening around us, whether it's climate change or something else that they're just so big we can't even really wrap our heads around them, but they're there and they could one day be the end of us. And the question for me was kind of like, is it paranoid for this guy to think about this all the time, or is he the right for thinking about this? And so this is a section when he kind of becomes, because he thinks, I won't read the section about the volcano about all the stuff about it, but this is a section when he starts to become paranoid and he starts collecting like emergency supplies from everywhere. And so
who's the character in this?
This is Lee still. I'll just keep it to those characters, not to I don't want to confuse everyone too much. So they're at his parents in Sugar House in Salt Lake City. Lee woke up in the middle of the night and had to pee. He sat up quietly to not wake Annalise, and then slid a t-shirt over his head and gym shorts over his boxers. He crept downstairs to use the bathroom. Someone, he didn't know who, perhaps his little brother Nephi, was in the bathroom on the main floor, so he went around the backside of the kitchen and opened the door leading down to the basement. A burst of cool, earthy air hit him as he turned the hallway light on and walked down the stairs to use the small bathroom. It was a half with only a toilet and a small sink. He yawned and looked through the bathroom cabinet absent-mindedly after washing his hands, and was surprised to see 2 orange prescription bottles on the middle shelf. He looked closer, squinting without his contacts in. One was a citalopram or something, 20 milligrams. The other fluoxetine, 40 milligrams. Antidepressants. He knew this because Becca was currently on a small dose of Lexapro. Were the meds his dad's? No, definitely not. His mom's then? Was she hiding pills in the basement bathroom? He knew many Mormon women were on antidepressants, but his mom, she'd never talked about being on anything. No one in the church really talked about such things. On the way out of the bathroom, something caught his eye in the corner of the basement. He crept over in the half dark. The light from the hallway stairs providing a dull glow. In the corner, he saw the basement shelves of well over 3 months' worth of emergency supplies stocked to the ceiling. He looked over the gear and began picking up a few items out, subconsciously. In 5 minutes, he had assembled a small pile of supplies: a blanket and first aid kit, some packets of food and canned goods. While in the past, Lee had found the stockpiling of emergency supplies a bit silly, a staple in most Mormon homes, Lee now found himself wholly given over to the idea. Perhaps it was the news of the supervolcano and the apocalyptic visions he'd been having. But he now found the idea of them traveling or living with at least a minor supply of food, water, warm clothes, fire starters, and so on incredibly foolish. They had a baby after all now. And so it was in this moment that Lee decided to steal a small portion of his family's emergency preparedness supplies. He was sure they wouldn't mind. His parents probably would have even offered, but Lee felt embarrassed asking for some reason. As he was pillaging supplies, Lee also found an old box of mementos marked Lee and opened it. Inside, the box was filled with some of his old soccer trading cards, pictures, toy figurines, and at the very bottom, a tomahawk, or throwing axe, with a skinny wood handle and black forged blade. His uncle had given it to him in middle school and taught him how to throw it. For a year, Lee had been obsessed with the thing, throwing it at whatever trees he could find, even setting up a mock axe throwing range in his backyard, with rings of old logs that sat upright on a table. But the next year, he was in high school and felt childish playing with such an item, and so abandoned it to his parents' basement. Yet now, over 10 years later, Lee was overjoyed to find the tomahawk, and axe throwing had now become a national pastime. As Lee took the items back up to his room, he passed a framed quote on the stairs that read, "We do live in turbulent times. Often the future is unknown. It behooves us to prepare for uncertainties." President Thomas S. Monson, "If ye are prepared, ye shall not fear." October 2004 General Conference. Lee nearly laughed out loud, thinking it was the one and only piece of advice from the church he could get behind. He walked back up the stairs, turned the hallway light off, shut the door, and returned as quietly as possible to their bedroom, depositing the armful of doomsday supplies on the computer desks beside the air mattress before checking on Annalise and slipping into the covers next to Becca. In his mind's eye, his dreams, he felt himself drawn, like the eye of Sauron to the ring, to images of the bubbling caldera under Yellowstone, its yellow and red lava hissing, creeping, slowly making its way to the surface of the earth, the wolves and mountain lions and grizzly bears all fleeing from the impending disaster in their mammalian omniscience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to begin with some questions and then turn it over to any of you who'd like to ask. I have to ask, you talk about the supervolcano. I'm curious, since this is your first novel, why you chose to write about Utah and all of these different things. What gave you the impetus to do this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is, I would say, well, first, this is kind of like the first book I've had published. I've been working on a collection of nonfiction for a while, but it's still, I haven't been able to figure it out quite yet. And so I while I was in my program, my professor, one of my mentors, told me, you know what, like you're kind of too interior thinking about your own life. Like, why don't you just try and write something completely different? And so then I just started working on this book about, this place I was living, and then one character would pop up in my mind, and then another would, and I would be, my wife and I would like road trips and like exploring the States. Then I would think about this place or that place, and it all kind of came to form in my head. And yeah, I think, it's set in Utah, but I've always, the West is really interesting to me growing up in it, and really never even like visiting besides New York. I think I've been in New York City twice, but otherwise I haven't lived east of Colorado. And so I just really wanted to, I grew up taking trips to Yellowstone National Park and, doing a lot of hiking and camping. And so I kind of wanted to have a book about that. And then about, each character kind of has a little bit of something I've encountered along the way as well, too.
Now this takes place in the future.
Yeah.
are you partial to dystopian fiction? Or do you see this as not dystopian? This is like an alternate.
No, so
Or do
I
you
see
see
it
this
as,
as where we're heading?
yeah, I see it as pre-dystopian. So there's tons of books written about right after a disaster has occurred. What does society look like? And so I kind of wanted it to be like right up and to the point
Mm,
of what happens. There's a book by Jesmyn Ward called Salvage the Bones, and
yeah.
it's about Hurricane Katrina, like kind of the moments leading up right before Hurricane Katrina. And I
Okay.
read that book and I kind of like that style of something, not, the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, but the moments leading up to it. Um, and I thought that would be really interesting. And so, yeah, I'm not really I like sci-fi and dystopia, but I don't have that big of imagination. So it was near future, but really only 5 to 10 years or maybe 20 years, in
So
the future.
you think in the next 10, 20 years, we're going to have a super volcano
Well,
erupt?
not that. That'll
Not
be,
that.
who knows. But with all the wildfires and stuff, things have gotten
They
bad
have.
in that regard, in a lot of ways, like more than I could see. I started this book 5 years ago. Um,
Oh,
and much, obviously all the things, some of the stuff in here could happen, tomorrow or is already happening.
yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. Um, who did you envision reading this book or taking to? Did you have a target audience? Or it sounds like from your professors that you were just writing more for yourself to get something down that felt true to you.
Hmm.
So you didn't really have you this isn't really genre fiction so much
No,
because
it's,
go ahead.
oh, sorry. Yeah, it's not, it's, I would say, literary fiction. And the target audience in my head was twofold. One were people who lived in Utah, and are very familiar with the state. And I tried to place a lot of little, what do you call them? Uh, Easter eggs throughout the novel
Easter
that
eggs,
people would
yeah.
appreciate. But then I also envisioned it as someone, in a nearby state, maybe, who's kind of like, oh yeah, like Utah is an interesting place. Like I go to the national parks there, or I know, there's just the sort of stereotype of it. And
Hmm.
so I wanted to write that book and be like, no, there's a lot more to Utah than your kind of just
Stereotypes.
stereotypes.
Okay. Um, because you seem to have included a lot of things in here that have either hit the news involving Utah or recently and earlier. I just wondered what you yourself thought about this misunderstood state. You said you loved it,
Yes.
or at least I don't know if that was in the recording. That was in our conversation previous to starting the recording. But
Yeah, no, I was telling Tanya before that my wife lived in Utah for 12 years. I lived there for 8, and we both love the state, and we didn't really want to leave, but then we had kids and wanted to be closer to family, so we left. But otherwise, we both love the state. I love the mountains and the desert and all. Like I love snowboarding and climbing and all that. And I like the food scene in Utah too. And to me, it was all these things that, right, are a part of the state that are, I don't know, that, any place is a more complex place than you make it out to be, right? So I live in Portland now, and if you just looked up national media about Portland, it would sound like a crazy place right now, but it's really not. Um, and same, and I think that's the beauty of fiction, is really kind of going into a place or a character and figuring out all those sort of juxtapositions that happen. What makes a good character. And so I sort of see, I guess cliche, but that Utah is kind of a character in the book too. Of it has, on the one hand, it has this religious history, but on the other hand, it has all this outdoor stuff. On the one hand, it has a story I like to tell that I just thought was interesting is I was going to, my other job is coffee. And so I was flying to Colombia for a coffee trip to go see a producer that we buy coffee from. And in behind me in line, these two white guys start talking, and they're both like, "Oh, you're going to visit your wife's family in Colombia? Like, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to visit my wife's family in Colombia." And then they start talking, and I just thought it was really interesting that these two guys had both basically had married, Colombian women and were part of the LDS Church, and then we're going back down there. And the LDS Church also had a big presence in South America.
Yeah.
And so that actually comes, that's one of the characters is basically a Colombian housewife. And so it was things like that that I just thought were really interesting. Like, and then we also have I lived in Rose Park in Salt Lake City, which is, kind of more of a Hispanic or Polynesian neighborhood as well, right? And there's just all these different, I tried to almost include too much because there's, I wanted to write about everything that, all the different little layers of Utah.
Uh-huh. Okay. Which I'm intrigued. Did you base the characters of Lee and Becca on you and your wife? Do you identify most with Lee in this book?
I do. And especially because, well, funny is, I mean, for the people who don't, I read the book, his full name is Levi.
Yeah.
And my name is Levi. But I really didn't mean to do that. I was trying to write about something completely different, but then, it kind of filters through, but very loosely, not in any way like auto fiction or something like that. It's very loosely.
Okay. Okay. And which character did you enjoy writing the most? Or
That's a
came,
good question.
okay, which did you enjoy writing the most and which came easiest for you?
Well, as you mentioned, Lee came the easiest to me.
Okay.
And then I think Emily would be the one that I enjoyed writing the most, which is basically the Colombian
housewife.
Yeah, like just imagining her kind of background and what she thinks of her day-to-day life. And
do you have any connection with Colombia other than going to buy coffee there?
No, not really.
No. Okay. So how did you research? What kind of research did you do for this novel?
So for this novel, I would say most of my research was lived research in some ways, like living in the place. And then going to Colombia, I also had I worked for another coffee place out here where my boss was Colombian as well.
Okay.
And I've been to Latin America. I mean, it's obviously different, but I'm somewhat fluent in Spanish, and so I've always loved that culture in some ways. And then I would hear stories of people too. Like I had two good friends read it, and who were readers, and they would be like, yes, I know. They would basically say, like, I know a person who is this, like who is basically this. Or they would tell me a story beforehand, and then I would, kind of translate it into the novel.
Oh, okay. I'm going to read. There's one question in the chat. When does this book take place? I think she wants a year or something. Or are you saying like 10, 20 years out?
Yep, 10 to 20 years.
Okay.
Near future.
And you visited all the places you wrote about?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, some places I know better than others. Like obviously living in Salt Lake, I know Salt Lake and that area really well, but I didn't quite know. A part at the end is the Watchman campground, and I've walked through there, but that's about it. I haven't really, stayed the night there or anything.
Okay. You have a favorite park in Utah? Is it Zion or another?
I like Zion, but Zion is is that contradiction, that piece that I wrote about, where it's awesome, but it's so crowded that it
It's
becomes
hard
hard
to
to enjoy.
enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I like going to that's a tough question. I like Capitol Reef because it's a little more people don't go there quite as much, which is
Mhm.
fun. And then a part of Utah also that I ended up spending a lot of time in was the San Rafael Swell,
Oh,
which is kind of in between Moab off I-70, but there's no towns around there. Um, but it's a good place to go camping, and there's slot canyons there and stuff.
gee, okay. Now, in writing about the church, the Mormons, did you have any practicing member read your book to make sure everything was accurate?
I did have one of the guys who read it was a former practicing member. He did his mission and had grown up in it.
Okay.
But I'm not a it's probably obvious to, if anyone
No.
is in the church, I'm not I grew up evangelical in like a conservative Christian church, and so I'm
Uh-huh.
familiar
Okay.
with I mean, they're different, obviously, but familiar in some ways. And I did have a really good friend growing up in Colorado who was LDS, and it was in high school, and so I would go over to his house, and there's one section when I talk about just going into the house, and there's like the paintings on the wall that some people have of the president and all that, and I got that from knowing him as a friend, and so loosely, not
Okay.
I'd be
Okay.
curious what anyone if anyone
Oh,
has any thoughts
well,
about
there was one mistake I think that my husband found. I haven't gotten to
that.
that part yet, but anyway. Um, my questions mostly are about the themes in this. Do you, it seems like I, is this, I love the way you started it with the prologue. It was almost smacked of a Book of Mormon type thing.
Mm.
Were you looking for that?
No, that's
Having
interesting.
someone
That,
discover this old record, you know?
yeah, I didn't think of the Book of Mormon thing exactly, but I wanted kind of an interesting framework around it of like why you know
Okay.
a record, but yeah, a record, yeah, it's a good way to put it.
Okay. Do you, it seems like, do you share as dim a view of Western humanity as this book seems to present, or was it only for the story? You
I'll
seem
say
to say the East is going to survive, the West is done for.
I will say some days I do. Uh, on my bad day, on my bad days, yes,
And
but not every.
where did you how did you clue into the Eastern approach to things? There seems to be, maybe I'm misreading this, but that there's we have two views of life. We have the view of community, what's best for the community, and then we have the view of the individual. And
Yep.
and of course in the West, it's all about the individual usually. So did you mean to put
That
that up as two
yeah,
opposing views?
I'm glad you caught that because that was one of the big themes of the book. Is when I started writing this, it just felt like there was a lot of stuff going on in the US, in America, that we weren't really, kind of like the super volcanoes, big things happening, whether it was racial justice or climate change, that we just really weren't acknowledging in some ways, and we just kind of tried to keep buried and not really bring it up, right? And you see that even more now. And honestly, when I was writing this book, when I was finishing it, it felt kind of weird because it felt like the tension has kind of broken in some ways, right? Everything's out in the open now, whether politics or natural stuff. So in some ways, it's good because very messily talking about these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Somewhat. If you could
Or
call it
arguing.
talking. Maybe it's yelling. I don't know. But it's no longer right. People aren't just ignoring it. I mean, some people are still trying to ignore some things, but anyways, yeah, people are talking about it. But I just thought it was and that speaking of just sort of the West and the kind of, I wouldn't necessarily call this a Western, maybe a neo-Western, but that idea of that the individual, and I really do think that and as we've seen with, I hope I don't turn anyone off, as with something like COVID or something, that it's just hard for people to sort of think about the larger community as opposed to their individual rights or liberties, and that is definitely in there. And also the sort of isolationism that comes with the sort of individualism. There's one character who's very isolated person and kind of troubled person in the book, and I do think that, right, you even see in places like Japan where people are, they're very comfortable just putting on a mask because that's what you do. And I'm not really I don't want to get into masks, but
Yeah, no, but no, my daughter said at her new school where she's a school counselor now, all the teachers are not wearing masks except the woman from China. Was it? Yeah.
yeah.
She's wearing a mask. Um, there was a question. Oh, what do you hope that your readers will remember most from your novel?
It's a good question. I would say the characters, but also the sort of the underlying themes, I guess I tried to get at, that are in the book too. Kind of like we're talking about, that it would make you think about these things in a kind of different way. And I think that's what's really unique about novels, is that it is a bigger kind of shared conversation that can exist in a much more, if you read, a much more productive way than just on the internet, and to really explore some big ideas. In some ways, I think I tried to do too much, and I didn't want to be too preachy in it. I wanted to be subtle, but so yeah, I would say the characters and the underlying themes, and then a big piece of it too is trying to create this sort of atmosphere, I guess, in some ways, of slight unease and slight
Tension.
discomfort that they would
Yeah.
kind of carry with them.
Yeah, that leads to my second to the last question: is this how you think things are going to play out if we don't change our course right now? Do you think that the West is going to
I
destroy
think
itself?
well, I think it will be very hard for the West to or certain places to compete in a sort of economy or world where you need some sort of collaboration and community and those sorts of things. If everyone is just sort of left to themselves and to their own individual things, I think there are going to be more challenges, like ecological or maybe virus related, that will prove even more challenging to come. And so,
Yeah.
but I have a lot of I'm not like there's a movement now to not be so climate doomsday, like to actually try and like think of not dystopian type works, but to kind of think positively about what the future could look like, and not just have it be dystopian or awful. But I didn't do that in the book. But I think
Now you said you started this 5 years ago, and so you were still writing this when COVID hit. Is
yeah,
that true? How did the pandemic affect this novel?
I definitely went back and reworked a couple things, just for fun, because I could. I included some. Well, actually, this isn't too far off, but I did include a scene of the characters putting on masks when they go outside.
Ah,
but that was more because I was imagining that the air in Salt Lake City is already kind of bad some days, right? Because of the inversion, that if
Mhm.
all this stuff keeps happening, just imagine it even worse, that I could see people, putting on, a sort of painting mask or hazard mask to like go outside occasionally.
Well, does anyone, oh, here comes. Okay, why start the book in Logan? Is it the geographical location?
Yes, the primarily the geographical. I just wanted to go right. I-5 goes through. It's the easiest way to hit go all through the state, Utah. But one of the characters kind of grew up evangelical and kind of left, and then one of the other characters kind of grew up in the LDS church and has kind of distanced themselves, and so they had both lived up there because none of their families were up there. So they were still in the state, but not, their families were in Salt Lake and Provo. And so it was kind of a good way for them to kind of be like, we're kind of distancing ourselves a little bit, not moving out of the state, but,
Right.
they didn't want to live in the same place that they grew up in, I guess.
Do
Oh,
any,
and Lee was going to school up there too.
oh, at Utah State.
Yeah.
Do any of our other viewers want to ask any more questions? Did you want to ask any? No?
Oh, nice.
Anyone?
Yeah, it
Oh,
says,
comment. Well, I love that you started the book in Logan. I grew up there. My family lived there. I now live in St. George. It's a long drive. So how many days does this trip take?
it is a long drive. Although my one friend said that, he said, it's a little implausible that it would take these characters a week to drive from
Oh,
Logan to Zion.
well, didn't they stop off? Don't they?
Yeah, they make stops at Salt Lake and Provo, and then go camping outside of the park. So I
Okay.
think it's okay. But yeah, it wouldn't. It's not necessarily a week-long trip if you don't want it.
Okay. Well, I'm wanting to read the rest. It's I thank you, Levi, for discussing and sharing parts of your book. And thanks too to those of you who posed questions. And remember, we have copies of Utah, a novel, in our store, or you can order through our website. And I put the links in the chat room. I will also, though, add those links in my follow-up email, along with the link to the recording for this. So if anyone that you think might enjoy this kind of book, share the links with them. And once again, Levi, thanks. Thanks to all of you who joined us today. And you'll get the follow-up email in a day or so. It takes me a while to get it onto YouTube. Anyway, all of you, let's hope and pray that there's not going to be a super volcano eruption anytime soon, and that we will all stay safe and well. Okay?
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah,
And
thank you for having
goodbye.
me. Thank you to everyone coming.
You're welcome.